We've talked about why we are here up on the Janiculum Hill, why this spot is specifically marked, and what its history has been. We've talked about the way in which this building was shaped by the architect Donato Bramante into the particular form it took as a little perfect temple, the Tempietto. We've talked about the materials of which it's made, the specific choices he made in order to make it a more meaningful, articulate building, and all of which goes to concretizing a very specific memory in a very specific place. But is there a larger context for this? Well, in the immediate sense, Bramante probably intended for this courtyard to be changed into a circular courtyard. And we have drawings from the 16th century that show what is supposed to be his project for a circular courtyard, which would have made this sort of Tempietto tabernacle almost like a relic contained in the reliquary of the courtyard. But there's an even larger context for this project. Bramante came to Rome perhaps with the hope of getting the project to do the new St. Peter's. Not that it was being discussed when he arrived, but he probably had a sense that something was in the air. Old St. Peter's was in danger of collapse, and he may have had the sense that something was about to be done. When Bramante designed this building, he gave it a very specific size, and as we've seen, a lot of that specific size conditioned a whole series of other aspects of the building. The specific size is this. The plinth that it sits on is exactly the same size as the oculus, or the hole, in the dome of the Pantheon, the most famous centrally planned building in Rome. Why would he do that? Why that particular dimension? Well, only a few years later, in fact in 1506, only 4 years after Bramante begins the building of this building, he's charged by Pope Julius II with building a new St. Peter's. And Bramante has apparently described his project for St. Peter's as putting the Pantheon on top of what he called the Temple of Peace, which was in fact the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. So Bramante's idea for the new St. Peter's was essentially assembling a new building out of the two best buildings from the ancient world that had survived in Rome. He was going to put the Pantheon on top of the best Roman basilica. But the fact that this building could fit on top of the Pantheon's oculus means that he was already almost thinking of this building as a kind of lantern to a new St. Peter's. And obviously the dedication here to St. Peter and obviously there to St. Peter is a natural one. But the idea that he would think of a new design for St. Peter's as essentially being an assemblage of pieces made up of other buildings, essentially, two great ancient buildings, and his one new modern contribution to that al antica way of making architecture. It suggests that Bramante was already thinking here at the Tempietto about a reform of architecture that would really transform the way we think about architectural space and buildings. And in fact, it did. Bramante fundamentally changed Renaissance architecture, and his projects for St. Peter's became incredibly influential throughout Europe for centuries. So this building is more than just a locus in a particular place. It's actually something that heralds a new way of thinking about architecture. And it's not merely a more beautiful way of making architecture, it's a more meaningful way of making architecture. It's a way of architecture being a kind of narrative, a kind of way of telling stories about a place and a function and a time. And as such, it heralds a whole new world, the world of Rome that would be transformed from Bramante's day on across the next 3 centuries. And it's that Rome that's immediately outside this cloister on the hill that we can see from the Janiculum. We can scan the city of Rome below and see that city that Bramante would have such an enormous impact upon.